Welcome back to the 11th block in our 16 block series. This is a simple block this week. I just wanted to play with a few fabric dimension pieces. I love these books by Kumiko Sudo, as she shows how to make origami with fabrics. And the little flower buds that we're going to make this week just came right out of this book. So if you can find these, pick them up. They're so much fun to play with. And then I just played with making a little ruffle out of a pressed circle. So we'll start by making a simple square and square block, one of the easiest yet most effective blocks. I just love a square and square. So I just started with a 2-inch square fussy cut fabric and a 4-inch square of a nearly solid, this black here, cut in quarters diagonally to surround it. Now, I know this is not the exact measurement for perfect piecing here. So since I'm just messing around, I didn't want to take the time to do all that math. So I took the easy road and I just made the triangles just a little bit larger, and then I can just trim them down after piecing. It's a little safer that way. So what I did was I just centered a triangle over one edge of the square, making sure that the point of the triangle was somewhat centered in the middle of the square, and I hand pieced it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And of course I always leave that 1/4 inch on each side, because I love to not have those seams pressed down. They're just a little bit easier to press the block when those seams are laying up. So I never stitch within a 1/4 inch of any edge. Okay, and then I added the next side, and I made sure that the edges of the triangle were relatively centered, falling off of that block. And then when you go with the third piece, just make sure that the point of the new piece that you're stitching on matches up with the point from the first triangle. And that will ensure that you're going to get, when you trim, you're going to get a square. So I stitched the third piece on, and then I stitched the fourth piece on. And once all of your triangles are stitched on, you can just trim the block a 1/4 inch away from the middle square points, which should give you a 3.5 inch block. So as you can see, I'm just putting the ruler up to that point. I'm scooting it over a 1/4 inch, and I'm just trimming off the side. So then I just surrounded the block with strips. So I took 2 strips of a brighter fabric that measure the 3.5 inches, and then width I did a 1 1/4 inch. So I cut 2 of those, and I just stitched those on to the top and the bottom. When I get to the seam allowance, I don't stitch those seams down, of course. I stitch through those seam allowances at the base. And then from coming up from behind the block, I just make sure that the needle is coming up right through that point, so I know I get that nice little point with that square. And then once I come up through there, I come up through the other seam, and then I just continue the stitching to that 1/4 inch from the side. And then same thing for the sides. I just did a 1 1/4 inch strip by 5 inches and stitched those on. So now I have a 5-inch block. Now I could piece more strips of a different fabric to get to the 6.5 inch block, but instead, since I want to play with tucking those ruffles into the corner, I'm going to applique this middle block to a background. That way I've got those sides free where I could just tuck anything into those seams that I wanted to, whether it's oya, trims, yarn, whatever. But right now I'm just going to do the corners. So I pressed the inner block, the pieced block, down along the sides, a 1/4 inch seam, pinned it to my piece of fabric, my background fabric, and then I appliqued around the sides, leaving 1 inch on each side of those corners for tucking. I did experience some shrinkage here, so if you are doing this and you want a 6.5-inch finished block, just go ahead and applique this onto a 7-inch block. That way you can just trim it down if you need to. So for both of these dimensional pieces, I just started with circles. For the ruffles, I used a 1.5-inch round template, and I cut 4 2-inch squares out of that nearly black fabric. For the flower buds, I'm using 2-inch round templates, so I cut 4 2.5-inch squares each out of 2 different fabrics. So I could draw this out, but I know that all I really need to do is just cut the little corners off there. Make sure you have your at least 1/4 inch seam allowance going around. Work that gathering stitch between, it's basically 1/8 of an inch from the edge there. I know we've done this before. I do this a lot. Now I could have done 2 circles stitched together and then turned inside out. When I go to press the ruffle, I know it's going to be pretty thick. So all I'm trying to do here is just fold the ends under, and this is really the fastest and easiest way. If you can get these perfect circles by Karen K. Buckley, you can make these out of mylar, out of even cardstock. Really simple, because all you're doing is gathering this around the circle and then pressing it with starch. And it'll keep those little folds down. And for the ruffle, we just need the top of it folded down, so. Okay, and then once you're all the way around, I'll just take my needle and run it to the right side of the fabric. Just make sure that's somewhat centered. It'll gather, right? And then pop this through a few of the ruffles. Make sure it's pulled good and tight. And then I'm going to take this to my pressing surface now. Just throw some Best Press or flatter spray or starch, whatever you have. Just one little squirt, and then just press it down so that when you lift the template out, this stays nice and crisp. So I'm going to do that, and I'll be right back. Okay, so this is all pressed, and then right where your gathering thread is, just to the right of that, I pull this template out. And then when I pull the thread, it gathers so that that circle stays just perfect. From there, what I did was I took and I just clipped it. Now this is serrated scissors, and there's starch on this, so it shouldn't fray too bad if at all. And I just cut it all the way to the center point. So then, and I'll do this over on my ironing surface because I'm gonna pleat it. So I took and let's see, I just folded the pleat like this. And just make sure that your pleat is running down to that center point here, and then press it with your iron. And then take another one, right, and then press that. And then once that's pressed, take another pleat, press that down. So I ended up with like, I think 5 pleats on each one. Okay, so I've pressed my ruffles. Just easier to do that off camera. Besides that, my ironing surface that I'm working on, I have used so much starch that it's just horrific. I don't want to show it to you. So before you stitch it in, go ahead and stitch the ruffles in place. So essentially, I'm just putting a little stitch in each one. It doesn't really matter what it looks like anywhere here because that's going to get tucked under the fabric. And I am just playing around here. I'm sure there's probably a way easier and better way to do this, but this is the way I came up with. So, okay, and then fold your next one. Put a little tacking stitch in there. Next one. You get the idea, just so that the ruffles stay. It's a little bit easier to tuck these in and applique them. when you have the ruffles stitched down here at the core. Now once you have the core stitched, you can just tuck those ends right under that corner, pin it in place, and then applique it from here to there. So I'll start that process. I'm just using the same thread and tucking it down behind the fabric, behind that big block to start. And then right where you left off in the applique, just continue up. Then this time going through not only the side of your applique piece, but all the way through the ruffle to the back and back up. And a lot of times, rather than trying to make this perfect point, I just make sure that this end is good, and then I can tuck that little flag in when I round the corner there. And then just make sure that the raw edge of the ruffle is tucked under here, and you can pin it. It's such a small piece and it won't take that long, so I just hold it. Make sure that's good and tucked under. There we go. And we'll stitch a few of the top pieces of the ruffle down too. So here's where the ruffle starts. So I'm going to go through the ruffle all the way to the back till I can feel the needle, and then scoop up all the fabric and come out the edge of the applique. In other words, the edge of our 5-inch block here. Okay, again, and when you get to the corner, just make sure all your raw edges are tucked under that corner. That gets tucked under, that gets tucked under, and then just continue along until where you stopped. Then once that's stitched down, what I do is I'll just take and just throw a few little stitches just to hold the ruffle down onto the fabric. Obviously we want the ruffles to stick up, but if we can just nail the back of the ruffle down, like the little inner corners, then that'll stay in place. So that one, and see that where it's tucked in right here, I'll just pop that into the fold. You know, 4 or 5 times, however many ruffles you have, that's how many stitches you'll want to do. So these buds have a double side to them, so that when you fold them, you get the benefit of both fabrics. So you just need to make a circle, a 2.5-inch circle. It'll be ultimately a 2-inch finished circle out of 2.5-inch squares. And the same exact way I did the black ones, just cut your circles out of your fabric, leave your 1/4-inch seam allowance here, stitch it, gather it, press it, and then I'll come back and show you how to stitch those together. Okay, so I've got my 2 circles. Now you might be thinking, without the templates, couldn't you just take the raw edge circles, put them right sides together, stitch them together, turn it inside out, and then just stitch the little turning open point? And you could. But for me, I like the crisp edges that this achieves, making the templates first, turning the edges under, and then just appliquing them together. Turning things inside out, it's fine. It's not my favorite thing to do. And the other thing about that is I don't get the crisp edges. Like if you look at the flower buds, the edges are so crisp, and I think if I turned it inside out, I'd have those little lumps there, and I like to see those little green stitches. So this is the way that I do it, but even in the book she says to take, you know, 2 circles of fabric and put the right sides together with the raw edges out and stitch them and then turn them inside out. But again, this is just the way that I like to do it. So either way, whatever you feel. So I'm just going to put I've got green thread on here, and I'm going to pop this out through the fold. And then how I stitch them together, I try to get as invisible as I can. I don't even pin these really, it's such a small circle. So right across from where I'm coming out of the purple fabric, I'm just going to stab my needle and pick up like 1 or 2 threads of the fold. Then from here, I'm coming out of the green. I'm going to go right back over to the purple. I'm going to insert it into the fold and travel under the fold for 1/8 of an inch, and then just come up on the green and pick 1 or 2 threads up on the fold. And then just work that all the way around. And honestly, it doesn't even take that much more time. If you ask me, I think turning something inside out and making sure all the edges are flat takes a lot more time than this. So I just work this all the way around. No turning inside out. When it's done, it's done. Okay, and now for the fun part. So once your circles are stitched together, if you have a long enough thread, you can do this. I think mine is borderline, but I'm going to try it. Or just start with a new thread knotted at the side here. So let me knot this. Oh my gosh, this woman is a genius, the way she folds her fabrics and makes the most amazing things. So what you're going to do is just fold this in thirds. So I'm folding it so that the inside, what I want the inside of the flower to be out. So when I flip this inside out, this is going to, the colorful fabric will be the outer bud. And if you can see, I'm folding it so that one side is a little bit smaller. So it's sort of folded not directly in half, but on an angle. Then what I did was I took, and right around the middle of this flower, so see my thread is coming out the middle, I'm going to come out onto the side here. And this is all going to be gathered, sort of. It's a lot of fabric, so it doesn't gather perfectly, but it gathers enough. And it's hard to work along the fabric top, so what I'll do is I'll stab it. Just make some stitches in the middle. And just work up and down. So it's almost in the center, but I'm erring on the side of towards the shorter petal here. But honestly, it really doesn't matter. These things are so sweet. And they're all gonna look a little bit different, which is great. That's nature. And then once you get past that crazy amount of folding fabric, you can just work along the top and make your last stitch right here. Then gently just pull together along that thread. And then what I do is I hold that in place. You don't want to pull too hard because you're going to break the thread. And then I'll just run my needle through a few more. Just to gather as much as I can. I'm just going to have just enough thread to be able to get it through these gathers. And knot it. And then you just fold this up. Just manipulate it a little bit so that that bud folds and sits in the center. So sweet. I love these. I could just make a million of them and make quilts just out of this. I love doing them. And then to stitch it in the background, as I just butted the flower edge up to the square, and I took black thread, just making sure that you're centered as much as you can. The bud is pointing up towards the corner, and you've got a pretty even amount of fabric on either side. Just hold that in place. And I'll start along the bottom just to get that nailed down just where I want. And just take a few quick little applique stitches to pop that in. Picking up the background fabric and then picking up the very back of that flower. And then just travel up the side, and what I do is I'll just pick up a little bit of fabric back here just to nail it in place, travel along the back, and then come back down. And then I think I love this block. I love this technique. I think it's so fun. There's so much you can do with it. But this yarn that I was thinking about using for the hummingbird last week, I think it'd be so pretty stitched along, you know, maybe down here, up here between the ruffles, and just on the ruffle and then back down. So I may play with doing that. It kind of frames it and makes it cute, so I think I probably will. So all I would do here is I would just take a red thread and I would just put a stitch in between every little flag. So if you had some novelty yarn that you wanted to use to frame your block, that would be super fun too. And voila, a finished block in not that much time. And I think if I were to use one word for this block, I would say festive. It's got a lot of look, but I love it. I love how bright it is, and I'm going to put this in my journal because I'm going to refer to it. I love this dimensional fabric play, so I might do some more dimension and add those to my journal as well. But speaking of finished, I want to share with you some of the blocks that have come in from our fellow stitchers. I am running out of adjectives to describe how beautiful and creative these blocks are, and thank you guys so much for sending your blocks in. I always love to see what you're working on and what you're doing and your colors and your fabric choices. It's so great. So thank you again so much. Next week, I think I want to play with taking a piece of fabric and the motifs and embroider over them and add to them with threads and embroidery. That's super fun to do. So if you have a fabric that you think could be enhanced with embroidery, grab that. Grab some threads and beads and yarns, and we will enhance some fabrics with embroidery. Thanks again so much for joining me, you guys. I really appreciate it, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.